Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm very happy, even more delighted than usually, to have this XPrag wine gatherings be an Italian one, because I have to confess that the Italian XPrag community is actually my favorite one. And I also have a very special connection with today's speaker. So Filippo is like a brother to me. So I met him in 2013 at the XPrag in Utrecht. I was still a PhD student then. I'm not sure if you had already finished, Filippo. Yeah,
no.
You were also a PhD student. And so we've had many things in common since then. And I have a hunch that the topic that Filippo will talk about today, that he has already kind of been thinking about it, because this is what he gave to my son after birth. So, and he told me to call it Nimchimsky. So obviously you also know that Filippo is very accomplished. So he's the co-founder of the Italian XPrag community together with Valentina Bambini. He has written like a countless number of articles and books and edited several books. And he's also been on the news a lot recently for his book on insulting. And today's talk is also in that spirit, basically. So the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks a lot. Okay, I'm gonna share the screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me here. Nicole, I'm gonna cry for this introduction. Thanks to Ira, thanks to Nicole, and thanks to you all. Okay, this is the wine that I'm currently drinking. It's a Rossese, a very good wine from the western part of Liguria. Light one, but very good still. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to present a work on expressives like jerk, which is the result of a collaboration with Bianca Cepollaro from Università San Raffaele Milan, and Isodora Stojanovic from Institute Nicod in Paris. Before starting, I think it's important to underline that I'm going to present a work which is a work in progress with the very, very preliminary results. We finished analyzing the data a few weeks ago. We haven't started writing the paper yet, and since we are still in time for revising our interpretation of the results and possibly aspects of the experimental design, we decided to take this occasion as an opportunity to get feedbacks and opinions. This is to say that we don't have neither a real take-home message to sell you, nor we intend to offer a real account of expressives. What we mean to do is to present some data that, to a certain extent, in our view, might represent a challenge for the current mainstream view of expressives. Okay, this is in brief the outline of my talk. I will start by illustrating what I will take to be the mainstream view of expressives such as jerk, bastard, or idiot. Then I will illustrate very, very briefly our previous results on stronzo, which is an Italian expressive that roughly translates with jerk. And then I will present our new studies on this expressive and discuss the results and their possible theoretical significance. Okay, so let me start from saying that the last couple of decades witnessed a growing interest in expressives and evaluatives, expressions that not only describe the world, but evaluate it. So, for example, we have on the one hand evaluatives like good, bad, loyal, pleasant, selfish, and expressive swear words, insults like idiot, bastard, and jerk. These are the categories that I will consider in this talk. So note that when we talk about expressives, we'll not include today things like slurs, terms that derogate individuals in virtue of their belonging to certain categories or social groups. Now, traditionally, the meaning of an expressive is considered a side issue entailment that doesn't affect the descriptive content of a sentence. In other words, expressives serve as a sort of emotional comment on the main point of an utterance. In one, for example, that jerk Marco is speaking, the main point of the utterance that Marco is speaking is supplemented by the content associated with the jerk or idiot that the speaker has a bad opinion of Marco. And for that reason, expressives are usually considered to be expletives. If we, roughly speaking, if we omit jerk or idiot from the sentence, the emotional inference disappears, but the true conditional content of the sentence remains unaltered. So take a sentence like one, again, that jerk Marco is speaking. There is a pejorative content associated with this sentence. And if we look at how this expressive content associated, for example, with jerk has been analyzed in the literature, we found different accounts of expressives that have analyzed the content in terms of, for example, a conventional implicature. For instance, Potts considers that attributive adjectives such as damn or fucking and epithets such as idiot, stupid, bastard, or jerk trigger conventional implicatures, secondary side issues, entailments conveyed as a matter of convention. Others have analyzed the phenomena as a particular kind of presupposition, automatically accommodated, a presupposition that is considered indexical, evaluated with respect to the context of utterance, and attitudinal, which predicates something about the speaker's mental state. Finally, recently, some authors like Tonhauser and colleagues have characterized expressives as a particular kind of projective content, which does not involve what they call the strong contextual felicity constraint. That is, to be used felicitously, it's not necessary that some implication associated with the expressive, an expressive like jerk, is established in the context of utterance before the utterance time. Okay. Now, in this talk, I'm not gonna present or discuss each of these accounts in details, and rather what we're going to do is to extrapolate from them the claims and the points on which they all seem to agree, and we are going to call it the mainstream view of expressives like jerk and bastard. Let me first note that the typical object of investigation in the mainstream view are what we call the referential uses of expressives in, for example, in demonstrative constructions like that jerk Marco is speaking, rather than in other syntactic positions. So even when scholars say that their theory is about the expressive jerk or bastard, they actually mainly test their intuitions on referential uses. And this is going to be quite important for the purpose of this talk, as I show in a second. Okay, let's see what are the main claims of the mainstream view. The first claim is that for an utterance like one, that jerk Marco is speaking, to be felicitous, it's sufficient that the speaker feels negatively about the target individual Marco, regardless of whether this is common ground and of how Marco is and of what other people think of Marco. Hence, in this view, as anticipated, a jerk imposes no strong contextual felicity constraint. That is to say that the use of jerk does not require that the associated expressive content is entailed by the context of utterance. It is part of the common ground before the utterance time. A second claim on which most accounts of expressives seem to agree on, is that terms like jerk express how the speaker feels about the target. That is to say that the expressive content is speaker oriented. So for example, if Ira or Nicole say that jerk Filippo is speaking, the expressive content associated with jerk is that Ira or Nicole feels negative about it. It's not something about how I am or how I behave. It's about Ira's or Nicole's feelings. So we wanted to test both claims, both of these claims. To test the first claim, we ran an experiment aimed at testing whether expressives impose a strong contextual felicity constraint or not. To test claim 2, we ran an experiment to assess whether the content associated with jerk is speaker-oriented or otherwise. Okay, we tested the first claim in our previous study that I'm going to present very, very briefly for devoting more attention to the new work. We published this work last year in Synthese, and it concerned the acceptability of the Italian expressive stronzo, roughly translated with jerk in a context. In this study, we broadened the scope of investigation by considering not only referential uses of expressives, but also predicative uses. So not just constructions like that jerk Marco is speaking, but also utterances like to Marco is a jerk. In this study, we had some stories where two interlocutors, for example, Luca and Sarah, talk about a third one, Marco. And at the end of the story, one of the two interlocutors, for example, Luca, said to Sarah either one, that jerk Marco is speaking, or two, Marco is a jerk. And participants were had to rate the acceptability of Luca's utterance on a 1 to 5 points Likert scale. We manipulated the context in order to generate two conditions and to present the target sentences in two possible contexts. First, a neutral context that included no information as to whether Marco is dislikable or behaves badly. And on the other hand, we had satisfying or supporting context that entailed that Marco is dislikable or that the speaker dislikes him. I'm going to clarify this distinction in a moment. Although, as predicted, we found that all expressions were less acceptable in the neutral, non-supporting context than in the satisfying, supporting one. Expressives were so to a greater extent, both in referential and in predicative positions. And as we argued in this paper, we took it as evidence that the expressive stronzo jerk imposes a strong contextual felicity constraint against what the mainstream view would predict. We also ran a follow-up study where we compared jerk with negative, non-expressive terms like hateful or unbearable. And what we found is that saying something negative about someone in a neutral, non-supporting context is significantly more acceptable when using a non-expressive rather than an expressive term. So in a neutral context, it's more acceptable to use a term like hateful than a term like jerk. Hence, the contextual constraints imposed by jerk, that was our conclusion in this paper, don't merely depend on saying something negative, but on using an expressive term. Okay, so let's recall claim one, according to which expressives impose no strong contextual felicity constraint. Our reply in this previous work was that they actually do. And what we found was that expressives require that the associated expressive content is entailed by the context before the utterance time. Okay, what about claim two? Claim two is that terms like jerk express how the speaker feels about the target. So that we say that the expressive content is speaker oriented. So again, suppose that, let me recall it, that again, Ira or Nicole says that jerk Filippo is speaking. The associated expressive content, according to the mainstream view, is that Ira or Nicole feels negatively about me, about Filippo. So our research question in order to test claim two is, what is the expressive content of the jerk, of stronzo? As you probably noticed in the previous studies, we didn't distinguish between different ways of spelling out the expressive content of jerk. In fact, it could be, as predicted by the mainstream view, speaker-oriented, saying that a speaker has a negative attitude towards the target. But we contrast with this hypothesis with other options, considering that the expressive content of jerk could be also target-oriented, amounting to something like the target is bad, or she or he has done something bad, or it could be intersubjective, something like the speaker and the interlocutors, or the speaker, the interlocutors, and others have a negative attitude towards the target. With these options in mind, we ran a second study, which is the main focus of this talk today. And in order to address the question about the expressive content of jerk, we ran actually two experiments, the rating task and the selection task. The experiment one, the rating task, involved 219 participants. They were all native Italian speakers, and the experiment was administered online. The materials included 27 sentences of the form X is a P, where X was an individual and P a predicate. 9 of which were target sentences, while 18 were filler controller sentences. Target sentences were all sentences like Marco is a jerk, where X was the target individual Marco, while P always the negative expressive jerk, obviously in its Italian version, so Marco è uno stronzo. And the target sentences were preceded by a context representing a fictional circumstance where 2 or more interlocutors were discussing about another individual. For example, Sara, Luca, and Chiara are at the pub with some friends. Marco is drinking coffee at another table. And the second context sentence was manipulated in order to generate different experimental conditions. For example, in the speaker-oriented condition, the sentence was Luca dislikes Marco. In the intersubjective, first intersubjective condition, it was Sara, Luca, and Chiara dislike Marco. In the second intersubjective condition, it was Sara, Luca, Chiara, and others dislike Marco. In the target-oriented condition, it was Marco is a fake and dishonest person. While in the neutral condition, no contextual information supporting the target sentence or the filler sentences was provided. The second context sentence was then followed by a statement such as Luca says to Chiara, Marco is a jerk. Therefore, both the target sentences and the filler were presented as utterances produced by one of the interlocutors taking part in the fictional verbal exchange. Fillers were of 2 kinds. 9 fillers included positive evaluatives, non-expressive predicates like kind, Marco is kind, wise, graceful, blah, blah, blah. While 9 fillers included negative evaluatives, non-expressive predicates like rude, Marco is rude, liar, impolite, unreliable, lazy, and so on. The procedure consisted in reading the context sentence and rating the acceptability of the target and of the filler sentences on the 5-point Likert scale. Okay, let's give a look to the main results. Okay, so here you see the mean rates to the target sentences containing the expressive jerk in each of the 5 experimental conditions. Most of the differences were statistically significant. The only differences that did not result to be significant were that between the 2 intersubjective conditions and between the intersubjective conditions and the speaker-oriented condition. These first results revealed 2 interesting effects. First, the target-oriented was the condition which elicited the higher average rates to the target sentences containing jerk as compared to the other conditions. And while the neutral condition, the non-supporting context, was the condition where the target sentences obtained the lower acceptability rates compared to the other conditions. We also analyzed the mean acceptability rates obtained by the target sentences containing jerk, the fillers, the negative fillers, and the positive fillers within the neutral condition only, so the non-supporting context. All differences were significant, and in particular, we observed that positive fillers obtained the higher acceptability rates, followed by the negative evaluatives, while the target sentences containing jerk obtained the lower average rates. Okay, concerning experiment 2, the selection task. In this experiment, we involved 112 native speakers of Italian, and again, the experiment was administered online. The materials were the same used in the experiment 1, the rating task, but the method adopted was a bit different. In this case, we had, again, a context scenario composed of by 2 context sentences and a target statement, Marco is a jerk, or the filler sentences. Afterwards, we presented to the participants 4 different possible paraphrases of the character's utterance. The speaker-oriented one, Luca dislikes Marco. The 2 intersubjective options, Sara, Luca, and Chiara, or Sara, Luca, Chiara, and others dislike Marco, and the target-oriented one, Marco must have done something bad. Note that in this experiment, we decided to consider a unique experimental condition. That was the neutral condition where no contextual information supporting the target or the filler sentences was provided. The procedure consisted again in reading the context sentences and, in this case, selecting the paraphrase of the utterance out of 4 alternatives. So this choice was elicited with a question task like, what does Luca mean to communicate? So it was about the speaker's meaning. Let's give a look to the results that we obtained with this with the selection task. Here you see the frequency of each response choice with the target sentences containing the expressive jerk. Again, all differences were statistically significant, but that between the two intersubjective options. The main effect that we observed was that the target-oriented option was the primary choice, immediately followed by the speaker-oriented option with the target sentences containing jerk. Concerning the negative fillers, the negative evaluatives like hateful or unbearable, we observed a similar pattern of results because, again, the target-oriented was the, let's call it the primary option, the most frequently selected as possible paraphrase of the negative filler sentences. While conversely with the positive fillers, the positive evaluatives like nice or polite, we observe a different pattern of results. The speaker-oriented option was more frequently selected as possible paraphrase of the positive fillers, while the target-oriented option represented the secondary option. Again, the two intersubjective options were rarely selected. Okay, let us look at some possible implication of these very preliminary results for possibly for a theory of expressives. Okay, let me say I'm gonna divide my observations into two sets. The first part concerns the acceptability of expressives in context. The second part regards the putative speaker-oriented character of expressives. Okay, so first we have to know that we replicated the results of our previous study published in Synthèse. For example, what we see is that in the neutral condition, the non-supporting context, jerk is less acceptable than in any other condition. Remember that in our previous study, in the Synthèse paper, we didn't distinguish between the speaker-oriented, the target-oriented, and the two intersubjective conditions. But we see that at any rate, in the neutral condition, the acceptability again drops down. Another effect that we replicated is the result of the follow-up study of the previous work. Expressives seem to be less acceptable than non-expressive negative terms like rude or unbearable, which seems to suggest, sorry, that acceptability isn't just a matter of saying something positive or negative. However, what we have seen in this new study is also that negativity seems to affect acceptability. What we see is, in fact, that negative terms, being them expressives or evaluatives, are in general less acceptable than positive evaluatives. Okay, note, however, that the idea that acceptability aligns with a tendency for target-oriented interpretation might be more controversial than how it appears. This is just a very first speculation, but I think it might be relevant. In fact, if on the one hand, we have seen that both expressives and non-expressive negative evaluatives tend to be interpreted as target-oriented, on the other hand, non-expressive negative evaluatives like rude or unbearable or hateful, which were assessed as more acceptable than expressives, seem to show a stronger preference for the target-oriented interpretation than expressives. This is just a very first speculation based on a preliminary analysis of the probability of option choice in the jerk stories and in the negative filler stories, which reveal that the odd of choosing the speaker-oriented over the target-oriented option with the jerk sentences was higher than in the negative filler stories. This is a very preliminary evaluation, but if this effect would be confirmed, this would suggest that the relation between acceptability and tendency for target-oriented interpretation might be more complex than one might initially think. So this is definitely something that cries out for further analysis and investigation, just a secondary comment. Let us instead now move to a second set of observations concerning the claim 2 of the mainstream view, that expressives convey an expressive content which is, we say, speaker oriented. Okay, we see that it might not be the case. And this is one of perhaps of the main, if this talk has a take-home message, this is the take-home message. This is one of the main results that we found in these preliminary new data. In the rating task, for example, we observed that in the target-oriented condition, where the context specified that the target was bad on some respect, for example, he or she is fake and dishonest, the acceptability of the jerk sentences, the sentences containing jerk, was higher than in any other condition. The second piece of evidence comes from the selection task, where the target-oriented paraphrase, that was the target must have done something bad, or jerk, was the most frequently selected paraphrase. Another interesting effect that we observed is that in general, as I say, the negative expressions tend to get a target-oriented interpretation. This is for the expressive jerk, but even to a greater extent with the negative non-expressive evaluatives like rude or unbearable, where, as I said, there might be a stronger preference for assigning them a target-oriented interpretation than a speaker-oriented one. But let me repeat that this is an effect that we have to investigate further. But surprisingly, when it comes to positive non-expressive evaluatives, they tend to be assigned a speaker-oriented interpretation. So when participants were asked to select a preferred paraphrase for utterances containing predicates like nice, they tended to opt for a speaker-oriented interpretation, like the speaker has a positive attitude towards the target rather than a target-oriented one, like X, the target must have done something good. Now, this polarity effect might appear surprising, but actually there are other studies suggesting similar asymmetries between positive and negative terms. For example, in a recent work published, I think, on Journal of Social Psychology, Goodwin and Dorway shows that beliefs about the moral properties of negatively valenced acts are seen as reliably more objective than beliefs about the moral properties of positively balanced acts. And this might open a new venue for interesting research. Okay, so to conclude very briefly, the aim of this preliminary study was to test, take a first step into an empirical investigation of two claims on which most of the existing accounts of expressives seem to converge. The mainstream view has mainly focused on referential uses of expressives in complex demonstratives. In our study, we introduced also predicative uses. A first claim on which the existing accounts of expressive converge is that an utterance containing an expressive like jerk, in order to be felicitous, does not require that the associated expressive content is entailed by the context before the utterance time. Hence, expressives can be uttered felicitously in any kind of context. In our synthesis paper and in this new work, we think we found evidence of the fact that both referential and predicative uses of expressives are sensitive to contextual information. Hence, this constitutes a first challenge for the claim one of the mainstream view of expressives. Second claim of the mainstream view is that the meaning of expressives is, we said, speaker-oriented, reflecting the speaker's attitude towards the target. What our new studies seem to suggest is that the mainstream view might not be on the right track when it comes to the meaning of expressives, because most participants tended to interpret expressives as target rather than speaker-oriented. This is, in fact, as we observed in the rating task, the contextual information that best supported the use of the expressive, and that was more likely to be identified as the intended meaning of an utterance containing the Italian expressive stronzo in the selection task. Okay, so as I anticipated, we We haven't built up a theory on this data yet. However, we think that perhaps they put on the table some challenges for an account of negative expressives. And very, very briefly, some possible theoretical developments on which we would like to work on. First, okay, so if and only if we accept that our data speak in favor of a contextual constraint imposed by expressives, then this ought to be explained in some way, okay? So the question is, does it change our view of the semantic nature of expressive content? How do we account for the linguistic requirement that expressives seem to impose in the context set? We think that this is going to be especially a challenge for supporters of the conventional implicature view. In fact, since conventional implicatures are secondary foreground entailments, we typically predict that they could be conveyed in any circumstance without imposing a specific requirements on the context set. Now, since presupposition, conversely, are usually considered to impose a strong constraint on the context, a presuppositional view perhaps could account for this effect, this contextual constraint that we think expressives impose on the context. However, this could work. This hypothesis could work only if we wouldn't assume the attitudinal character of the expressive content. And consequently, the idea that the presupposition activated by expressives is automatically accommodated by the interlocutors, by the speech act participants. And the reason is that the target-oriented character of the expressive content that we think characterize expressives wouldn't entail an automatic accommodation, and consequently, this could explain the strong contextual felicity constraint that expressives seem to impose. Note, however, that there's the risk that a problem goes out the door and comes back in through the window, because admitting that the presuppositional status of expressives would also imply recognizing that as presupposition triggers, expressives have a projective behavior. However, while as widely recognized referential uses of expressives seem to exhibit a projective behavior, when they occur in predicative positions like Marco is a jerk, we have the intuition that they do not project. So the question is open and cries out for further investigation. And finally, but this is just a very side remark, it might be interesting to investigate whether positive and negative tick terms and expressives exhibit different semantic behaviors. I think that's all. I want to conclude with this picture where you can see me on the left, Bianca Cepollaro, which is the co-authors of this work, and on the right, Diana Mazzarella. We took this picture 2 years ago in Edinburgh at the last XPrag conference. I really hope that we could come back soon to organize XPrag events in person and take pictures like this with all the friends of our community. Thanks a lot.
I share the same hope. Thank you, Filippo.
Thanks.
I think I just asked a question just to get us started.
Mm-hmm.
What were the exact instructions? It's actually kind of a clarification question. Like, what were the exact instructions that you gave? Because, in order for it not to be, say, presupposition, it would depend on like what the participant thinks they're doing. Because like when you hear that, that jerk Marco, you are inviting a kind of shared attitude about him. Like if you're in a position to say something that strong about somebody, it implies that you have an attitude that you think might be shared with the listener. So I'm wondering then, whether the instructions might play into that or not.
So you mean the
acceptability?
Or the semantic?
Yeah,
sorry, I don't understand whether you refer to the instruction in the question task or to the semantic instructions that.
Oh no, sorry, I'm talking about the task.
The task. Okay. In the rating task, we asked to assess the acceptability of this character's utterance, something like how acceptable is X's utterance, without providing any definition of acceptability. So you mean that, okay, so you mean, yeah, okay. One might suspect that our acceptability judgment don't say too much about the presence of a semantic instruction in the lexical meaning of expressives, but it's more about the social acceptability, something that has to do with the politeness. That's the point you made, right? Yeah, if it is, I think there is one possible line of reply to this objection, perhaps, plus a couple of empirical facts that challenge this critical interpretation. I mean, I think that one possible reply is that perhaps there might be not a big difference between a judgment of linguistic acceptability and of social acceptability. So in other words, the content that the expressive requires to be entailed by the context in order for an utterance containing jerk to be felicitous, and the content that makes the use of the expressive socially justified might be the same. I mean, one possible answer is that the information that constitute the semantic constraint for the use of the expressive is the same that constitute an appropriate justification for the use of the expressive term in a social context. This is for expressives, but perhaps it applies to other expressions too. Think of, I don't know whether it is an appropriate example, but think of an utterance like, John has given up beating his donkey, okay? And the semantic constraint imposed by the trigger is that the context has to entail the presupposition that John used to beat his donkey. But the availability of such information in the context is something that impacts also on the social appropriateness of such an utterance. Think of I don't know, a neutral context. In a neutral context, for example, John might feel offended and outraged by that utterance and reject this accusation by noticing that there are no reasons to think that he has ever beaten his poor donkey. Okay, so that might be a line of reply. There are, I think, other two considerations to answer to this sort of objection. Well, the first one is that if one can agree that the acceptability was interpreted as social acceptability in the rating task, where the question task was how acceptable is the speaker's utterance, I think it's hard to apply this line of reasoning to the selection task too, where the question task was explicitly about the content of the speaker's utterance. Okay, so since it was what does X, the character Luca, means with his utterance. So my intuition is that it is quite improbable that participants interpreted this question task in the selection task as is the speaker's utterance socially appropriate, or is the speaker authorized to use an expressive in that context? Actually, sorry, can I add just one more comment? There is, okay, suppose for a moment that there is another empirical fact that challenges this sort of objection. Suppose for a moment that my line of reply doesn't hold, okay? So linguistic acceptability and social acceptability are two different sorts of judgments, okay? So we are testing, we could test two different things, okay? So how do we explain the fact that in the rating task, we didn't observe a neat difference in terms of average rates between the speaker-oriented condition, where the information available in the context was that the speaker had a negative attitude towards the target, and the two intersubjective conditions, where the information available in the context was that the speaker plus other interlocutors plus others have a negative attitude towards the target individual. I mean, after all, we should predict that it is more socially acceptable to call someone a jerk in a context where all interlocutors and perhaps others think that the target is a bad person, than in a context where only the speaker has this feeling and the other interlocutors are either neutral with respect to the target or they even like him. So this is definitely not a final response to your objection, but if our experiment was testing a sort of social acceptability, I would have expected to find a difference between in the rating task between the speaker-oriented condition and the intersubjective conditions.
So there are many questions coming up
Oh, cool.
in the chat, many interesting comments also. So Gregory, would you like to ask your questions?
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wrote them all in, but I'm happy to read what I wrote because I wouldn't remember it otherwise. So, sorry. And I can paraphrase what I wrote in the chat. So I think maybe, Filippo, at the very end, you mentioned for future study, wanting to look at positive expressions. I know you use positive fillers, but have you looked at, and I gave some examples, I'm not sure if tesoro would work in Italian, but with positive fillers, with positive expressives, what do you think about those and what's your prediction? And then I have a second part.
Well, it depends. Can you make me an example of a positive expressive?
Yeah, I have it in the chat. You know, that's
sorry.
That sweetie Marco is baking us cookies again today.
Okay, I don't know whether Bianca has some thought about it, but I don't have specific predictions about the interpretation of positive expressives. I would say that, we found this difference between negative terms being them expressive or evaluatives, and on the one hand, and positive fillers on the others. And the difference was that the negative terms were evaluated as target oriented, while the positive fillers as speaker oriented. So it would be probably more inclined to think that this tendency to assign a target oriented interpretation, I'm tempted to use the term objective, but I don't want to speak of objective interpretation because this is not the case. It's more likely to be assigned to negative terms, while the speaker or subjective interpretation is more likely to be assigned to positive terms in general, being them expressives or evaluatives. Perhaps it also depends by not only some semantic features that distinguish negative and positive terms, but also by our implicit moral psychology. Perhaps we evaluate differently negative and positive terms. When we say something negative, perhaps we assume that we say something negative because there is a fact that support our negative judgment, while when we say something positive, the merit is our, let's say. No, but there are actually some recent studies that show differences like this, as that I mentioned before, published on Journal of Social Psychology. So that's something that would be nice to investigate.
It's interesting. It's a very charitable interpretation. That is, when there's a positive expressive, it accrues to the speaker, and negative accrues to the target. It's very positive. But that leads me, and I'll get to my second question, but one further thought on this. If you set up the context in which the hearer, the addressee, has a very strong negative attitude towards the speaker, that might disrupt that charitable tendency to attribute positive affect to the speaker for positive expressives. If the hearer despises the speaker, it might not work that way. It would be interesting.
I'm totally sympathetic with this intuition. And look at actually the idea that certain expressives are more tending to be assigned a let's call it for a moment subjective interpretation, while others an objective interpretation is something that is also predicted by, for example, by Kaplan in his seminal work on the semantics of oops and ouch. At a certain point, he says that oops is not attitudinal at all because it has to do with something factual, while ouch is a subjective expressive because it expresses something about the state of the speaker. So this is important because we admit that different expressives could entail different contents or different rules of use. So we don't want to generalize our data about jerk to any other expressive. So as far as our data pose a challenge for the mainstream view, this is valid just for that specific expressive that is thrown. So.
Good. Do I have time for the second one? I don't want to monopolize the remaining time. You tell me.
So we have 15 more minutes. Maybe if you can.
Why don't we come back? We'll see how other people are doing. We'll come back.
Let's do that. Great idea. Let's do that. Come back to it if there's time. Absolutely fine. Thanks.
It's like I'm next.
Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I had a question. It's a kind of the general question, has to do with cross-linguistic similarities and differences in the use of expressives, in particular pejoratives. So, for instance, in English, and I believe this would apply in Italian and other Indo-European languages, you can get these positive uses, which you described as the referential uses of expressives like that jerk Marco, but you also have subjects like that jerk just got the job, as opposed to that jerk Marco got the job, where you have both descriptive and expressive meanings together in the subject, and that might affect the results of your study. So that's one half. The other half has to do with whether Italian, like English and French, divides pejorative expressives into two classes. One of them which have true pejorative meaning, and the other where the meaning can be watered down so that you're kind of sympathizing or empathizing with the subject and treating them as somebody that bad things happen to, rather than that somebody that does bad things. So you can get that poor bastard, he couldn't really help it, or the poor SOB, or the unfortunate bastard, or a schmuck can be, that poor schmuck, or it can be somebody who does terrible things, but you can't say, that poor asshole, he couldn't help it. And I think jerk is like asshole in that respect, although there may be some dialect differences. French also has two classes of expressives, depending on whether you can feel bad about someone that bad things happen to, or whether someone is responsible for doing bad things. And it'd be curious to know if Italian, for instance, if a stronzo could be, is more like asshole or more like bastard in that respect. And whether that's something you've looked at all.
I don't know. Bianca, do you have any intuition about that?
I would check whether whether in Italian we have any that behaves in this sort of friendly, not or empathic way. Because
yes, it's a good way to put it. Right.
Yeah, like I can't really think of one. I thought of sfigato, which would be looser, but doesn't really work.
Yeah, I'm told that con and connaud in French, for instance, differ in that way. And there are probably other examples in other languages, German, Dutch. I'm not sure what your intuition.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I mean, there are, of course, mocking insults or polite uses of insults, of course, but I don't know whether we have such a distinction of categories of expressives.
No, and if I may, like some seem to rather target the moral status of a person, and the other like their intelligence. And I don't see the former to work in the way you describe.
Right.
Latter would have better chances, but still like
they're still quite negative rather than as saying that.
I can pity this person, but this person is obviously completely stupid.
Well, schmuck is kind of like that in a way, but it's not necessarily stupid. It's just very unlucky and always the butt of the joke and so on. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was still thinking about. I have to think about it, Bianca.
So Eve has a pretty brief question. I don't see.
Yes, I was wondering whether expressives could be attributed to the addressee. So that if, for instance, the speaker says something like, your bête noire has actually been very helpful this week, what you're saying is that your addressee regards that person as a bête noire, but you as a speaker do not. And that seems to me, it's different from your speaker versus target. It's actually picking up someone else's view, but using, say, the same range of expressives.
Yeah, like I guess this is, thank you very much. I think it should be compatible in the sense that if you think that a given item triggers some kind of expressive content, you can spell out this content as speaker-oriented or as target-oriented. And once you've done that, you can play around with it in perspectival uses. So I'm not like, I think, so this is not something we have thought about, but I think that perspectival uses would sort of supervene on whatever account you have of, but thanks, we'll think about these cases.
Jacopo, would you like to make your suggestion?
Yeah, very minor thing. Thanks, guys. This is really fun. Hi. I was wondering, did you think about a comparison, more direct comparison with conventional implicature and presupposition, so that to make the claim stronger, both of experiment 1 and experiment 2? And related to that, the second part of the question was, when you ask, I don't remember exactly what you asked in the second experiment, right? What did Luca mean, or what did Luca want to communicate? Because if there are these two aspects of meaning, like a descriptive and a more subjective, and one is not at issue, I wonder whether the question is targeting at issue content. And so that's why that you see more target-oriented interpretation, although you have the positive case, which is a bit at odds with that.
So I'll take the first and feel the second.
No, I prefer the first one. Anyway, okay, let's do this. Okay. No, Bianca, sorry, I didn't want to switch your microphone.
As for the first one, yeah, we've thought about it, and we gave up because of a major difficulty, but maybe this crowd can actually come up with a great solution. So the difficulty is that if you compare expressive stuff to non-expressive stuff, you're so likely to find different behaviors that whatever we find is not really telling. So the only interesting result would be to find no difference whatsoever. And then like everything, yeah, please.
I agree, but can't you compare satisfied or supporting context to neutral context and see whether there is an interaction, and maybe that helps a little bit?
Yeah, that's something we could do, actually. Yeah, that may be a...
Yeah, I still think that we cannot over-interpreting these kinds of things, because it's just to be expected that there are important differences, but maybe your suggestion of like having both, yeah, maybe that.
Yeah. Now, and another thing what we thought to do is to which is a follow-up study we had in mind, to use a cancellation task, and where, in order to check which between the target-oriented and the speaker-oriented paraphrase is considered the best candidate for canceling the expressive content. Something that we could formulate, this is not correct, but with the but, like, I don't know, Marco is a jerk, but he hasn't done something bad, or but I don't think he's a bad person. I think the use of the but might create some problems, so we have to find another strategy, but that might be a solution.
So Clara has a comment.
Yeah, thanks for this interesting talk. I was wondering if you had looked at some recent work by Daniel Gutzman that analyzes expressives. So he has a difference between pure and mixed expressives. And pure expressives are the real expressives, so they behave actually as expressives have been characterized in the literature, while mixed expressives don't. And one important characteristic, one syntactic characteristic of pure expressives is that they cannot be found in predicative position. So since Stronzo can be found in predicative position, it seems to me that it's not a pure expressive. And so that would explain the speaker, not the non-speaker oriented thing, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. So that would absolutely count as a hybrid expressive in Gutzman's taxonomy, but this is not really the end of the story, because in his taxonomy, things like slurs would be there, and we find intuitively that these terms have different projection patterns when they are in the predicative position. So if we follow this path, I think we would arrive to a point where we say that there are more distinctions to be drawn within the category of hybrid expressive.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and now Alex.
Yeah, hi. Also, thanks for the talk. So I have more of a clarification question. I guess some of the stuff was in the experiment was sort of quick, and I wasn't able to take enough screenshots of it. So I'm curious about what you assume sort of what has to be entailed by the context exactly for the strong felicity condition. So whether it's just that sort of strictly that in fact you know that the speaker, or what, not speaker, but in principle that there has to be something about sort of a negative attitude that is present, or whether it has to be just something about like a justification for that explicit attitude. So whether, I don't know, I could imagine that it's fine to hear somebody say that if you know why they're calling somebody a jerk, even if you didn't know beforehand that they had exactly this kind of attitude. So I'm just, and I wasn't sure what the items looked like for that to be relevant or not.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the rating task mainly. Yeah, okay. In the rating task, we had we manipulated the context in such a way that it varied the availability or unavailability of contextual information and the type of contextual information provided. For example, the speaker-oriented condition made explicit in the context that the speaker disliked the target, and that was the exact phrasing we used. Similarly were phrased the intersubjective conditions, while the target condition provided an explicit justification for inferring that the target individual had done something bad, something like the target is fake and dishonest. While conversely, in the selection task, the option that could be selected that corresponded to the target-oriented option was less informative and more general, something like the target must have done something bad, because of course, providing again information the target is bad and fake would have been considered by the participants probably too much informative to be. They felt unauthorized to opt for that option because they had no elements to infer such a precise content, to derive such a precise conclusion about the target.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
And finally, Camilo's question.
Hi.
Ciao,
so
Camilo.
thanks a lot for the talk. I think maybe you already answered it. I think somewhat, but it struck me that it could be possible that at least for the acceptability task, that there's some type of redundancy that might affect the ratings. So if we assume let's say we assume the position that expresses encode the speaker's perspective, it could be the case that participants thought that these sentences, the target sentences, were less informative because they were redundant. I was wondering if, but I think you've already answered it that this might not be the case in the selection task. But yeah.
Sorry, but how do you think that this redundancy could have affected the results?
Well, if the context sentence says something like Marco dislikes Luca, and then the target sentence says Marco says Luca is a jerk, participants might be thinking that this is not very felicitous because we already know the speaker's perspective in the context sentence. Why would we repeat the speaker's perspective in the target sentence if expresses really encode speaker's perspective? Whereas in the target-oriented context, you have first this kind of like general statement, like Marco is a terrible person. And then as a consequence, Luca says, oh, Marco is a jerk. So in this sense, if expresses encode speaker's perspective, it would be more felicitous to go from the general statement to the perspective of the speaker when Marco says Luca's a jerk, than to just repeat the speaker's perspective both in context and in target sentence.
This is a very good point.
So it could be an alternative interpretation, yeah. But I think this affects your selection, the selection task less, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, that would be our reply, I think, Bianca.
Yeah.
But still, I have to think.
Thank you, Camilo, for this style of answering already the question with a great solution. I love this.
So Vinicius also has another interesting comment about a free production study, but unfortunately we're running out of time.
But I have a very fast answer.
Yeah, okay.
So it's kind of hard to get people to use these words because they are vulgar words. So it's kind of hard to like get them typing insults online. What we did try in the free production at some point was to have free production for paraphrases. Like, what do you think happened there? How would you describe whatever? And all sorts of crazy stuff, unicorns and whatever you can think of came up. So that's why we didn't present it today.
Okay, that's very interesting and entertaining. So
sorry, Nicole, if anyone has other comments, please, if you can, send emails to us, because that would be great. We are starting writing the paper, so any feedback is welcome. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and Camilo's style is especially appreciated.
Especially if you also provide the answer, there's going to be a lot of co-authors.
Okay, so I'll send you an abstract for the talk. So I'll try to put together the chat so that you have like a transcript of the discussions.
That's really nice.
Thanks a lot,
so thank you again, everyone, for the interesting talk and for the fruitful discussion. So as you've already heard, we're going to take a short summer break, and then we'll be back with a talk by Daphna Heller and Sarah Braunschmidt on Common Ground. So have a very nice summer break, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Ciao a tutti.
Bye.
A tutte.
Ciao, ciao.
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 Stop the recording. Can I stop?
I'm going to do it.